Thomas Reed had always known these woods like the back of his weathered hands. At 34, he'd spent his entire life in the village of Milbrook, working the same land his grandfather had farmed, following the same forest paths he'd explored as a boy. The morning mist that drifted through the ancient oaks held no mysteries for him, except on this particular autumn day, when he heard a voice calling for help from the direction of Miller's Creek. Thomas dropped the bundle of firewood he'd been carrying and ran toward the sound, his boots splashing through the shallow stream that wound between the towering trees. What he found made his heart race with alarm. A young woman with long blonde hair was trapped waist-deep in what the locals called Devil's Bog. A patch of treacherous quicksand that had claimed more than one unwary traveler over the years. She was struggling against the muddy grip, her expensive-looking hiking clothes now stained with marsh water and panic. "Don't move," Thomas called out, immediately recognizing the danger. "The more you fight it, the deeper you'll sink." The woman, she appeared to be in her late 20s, looked up at him with frightened blue eyes. I can't get out." I was following what I thought was a path, and suddenly Thomas was already moving, grabbing a sturdy fallen branch, and testing the ground around the bog's edge with careful steps. Years of living close to the land had taught him to read the subtle signs of safe passage, the firmness beneath moss-covered stones, the way certain grasses grew only where the earth was solid. "What's your name?" he asked, keeping his voice calm as he positioned himself at the bog's edge. "Sarah," she said quickly. "Sarah Mitchell." Thomas caught the slight hesitation, but didn't press. People came to these woods for all sorts of reasons. Some to find themselves, others to lose themselves. Her real name was her business. "All right, Sarah, I'm Thomas. I've lived in these woods my whole life, and I'm going to get you out of there. But I need you to stay completely still and trust me." He extended the branch toward her, bracing himself against a solid oak root. "Grab hold, but don't pull. Let me do the work. We're going to take this very slowly." What followed was a careful dance of patience and trust. Thomas had helped animals out of this same bog before, deer. Even a lost calf once, but never a person. The quicksand released its grip grudgingly, inch by precious inch, as Thomas used leverage and steady pressure to gradually extract Sarah from its muddy embrace. 20 minutes later, both of them were breathing hard as Sarah finally found solid ground. She was covered in mud from the waist down, shivering from cold and shock, but alive and safe. "Thank you," she gasped, tears mixing with the dirt on her cheeks. I really thought I was going to die in there." Thomas shrugged off his heavy wool jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Devil's Bog has been catching people off guard for generations. The trick is knowing where it hides. Are you hurt? Can you walk?" Sarah tested her legs, grimacing at the weight of the mud clinging to her boots. "I think so, but I'm completely lost. I was trying to find my way back to the main road." "That's a good 3 miles from here," Thomas said, studying her pale face with concern. "And you're in no condition for that hike. My cottage is just through those trees. You can clean up, warm up, and I'll drive you wherever you need to. Go." Sarah hesitated, and Thomas understood her weariness. She didn't know him after all, but the alternative was wandering through unfamiliar woods, exhausted and disoriented. "I have a landline," he offered. "You can call someone to pick you up if you prefer." The relief in her eyes was unmistakable. "That would be wonderful. Thank you, Thomas. I don't know how I can ever repay you for this." Thomas's cottage was exactly what Sarah might have expected from a man who seemed so perfectly at home in the wilderness. Rough-hewn wooden beams, a stone fireplace, shelves lined with books about forestry and farming. But there were surprising touches, too. Classical music playing softly from an old radio, oil paintings of local landscapes that showed real artistic skill. "The bathroom's through there," Thomas said, pointing down a short hallway. "I'll heat some water for tea. And there are clean towels in the cupboard." As Sarah cleaned the mud from her skin and borrowed one of Thomas's flannel shirts while her clothes dried by the fire, she found herself studying this unexpected sanctuary. Her host was clearly educated. The books ranged from agricultural science to philosophy. But he'd chosen a life of deliberate simplicity that she'd never encountered in her world of boardrooms and charity galas. "Better?" Thomas asked when she emerged, offering her a steaming mug of tea. Much, thank you. Sarah settled into a chair beside the fire, still wearing his oversized shirt over her cleaned hiking pants. You live here alone. For the past 5 years, Thomas said simply. I inherited the cottage from my grandmother along with 40 acres of mixed woodland and farmland. It's enough to live on if you don't need much. Sarah sipped her tea, studying his face in the firelight. There was something peaceful about Thomas that she rarely encountered, a contentment that seemed to come from deep within rather than from external achievements. What brought you out here today? Thomas asked. Most tourists stick to the marked trails. I needed to think, Sarah said honestly. About some family obligations, some decisions I have to make. She paused. I saw the path and thought it looked peaceful. I wasn't expecting quicksand. Thomas chuckled. Most people don't. The bog shifts with the seasons. Spring rains make it wider. Summer heat makes it deeper. The locals know to avoid it, but visitors. He shrugged. That's why I always listen. For calls for help when I'm working in the woods. They talked through the afternoon, sharing stories carefully edited for a stranger's ears. Thomas spoke about his decision to leave his job as a forest ranger to focus on sustainable farming. Sarah described her love of hiking and her struggle to find meaning beyond the expectations others had for her life. What she didn't mention was that those expectations included running Sterling Industries, the technology empire her father had built from nothing. She didn't speak of board meetings and merger negotiations, of the crushing weight of knowing that thousands of jobs depended on her decisions, or of the loneliness that came from never knowing if people cared about her or her inheritance. Here in this simple cottage with this genuine man who had risked his safety to help a stranger, she was just Sarah Mitchell, a woman who'd gotten lost in the woods and found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. I should call for a ride, she said reluctantly as the sun began to set through the windows. Of course, Thomas said, but she caught the note of disappointment in his voice. The phone's on the kitchen counter. Sarah made the call to her security detail, giving careful directions to Thomas's cottage. She had perhaps an hour before they arrived to take her back to the world of corporate responsibility and calculated relationships. Thomas, she said when she returned to the living room. What you did today, saving my life. Most people would expect some kind of reward. Thomas looked genuinely puzzled. Reward. For doing what anyone should do. Not everyone would have risked their safety for a stranger, Sarah said quietly. And not everyone would have opened their home to someone they'd never met. Maybe not, Thomas acknowledged. But that says more about them than it does about me. Besides, he smiled. You've given me something, too. What's that? A reminder that there are still people in the world worth saving. When the black SUVs arrived an hour later, Thomas walked Sarah to the edge of his property. The security team, professional, efficient, clearly expensive, exchanged glances that Sarah pretended not to notice. Thank you, she said again, meaning it more than she'd ever meant any words. For everything. Take care of yourself, Sarah Mitchell, Thomas replied, pressing a small wrapped package into her hands. And maybe next time, stick to the marked trails. Sarah climbed into the SUV, clutching Thomas's gift, one of his small landscape paintings depicting the very woods where he'd found her. As they drove away, she watched his cottage disappear among the trees and felt a part of her heart remain behind. Over the following month, Sarah found reasons to return to the area. She bought property near Milbrook, claiming she needed a retreat from city life. She donated anonymously to local environmental causes, ensuring that Thomas's woods would remain protected. And sometimes when the weight of her corporate responsibilities became too much, she would drive out to walk the marked trails, hoping for a glimpse of the man who had shown her what kindness looked like without expectation of return. Thomas never asked about the expensive car she sometimes parked at the trailhead, or why she always seemed to have her phone turned off during their chance encounters. He simply welcomed her company, shared his knowledge of the forest, and gradually, carefully allowed her to become part of his quiet world. It was Sarah who finally told him the truth. 6 months after that first meeting, they were sitting by Miller's Creek watching the sunset paint the water gold when she couldn't bear the deception any longer. My name isn't really Sarah Mitchell, she said quietly. Thomas nodded unsurprised. I figured as much. The security detail was a pretty big clue. It's Sarah Sterling, she continued. And my father was Jonathan Sterling. Understanding dawned in Thomas's eyes. Everyone knew the Sterling name, even in rural communities like Milbrook, the technology mogul who had revolutionized digital communications, who had died the previous year, leaving behind a fortune and a daughter who'd inherited more responsibility than most people could imagine. That's quite a secret to keep, Thomas said. Finally, Sarah waited for the change, for the calculation to enter his eyes, for the careful recalibration that always happened when people learned who she really was. But Thomas just continued watching the creek flow past their feet. Does it change anything? She asked, vulnerability clear in her voice. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. It explains some things. The way you talked about family obligations, the decisions you had to make. The sadness in your eyes sometimes like you're carrying the world on your shoulders. He turned to look at her directly. But it doesn't change what I know about you, Sarah. You're kind. You're thoughtful. You find joy in simple things like sunrise over the creek. You're brave enough to venture into unfamiliar woods when you need to think. And you're honest enough to tell me the truth when you didn't have to. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. Most people see the money first. Everything else becomes secondary. I've never been particularly impressed by money, Thomas said simply. I've got everything I need right here. But you're remarkable. With or without a fortune. They were married the following spring in a small ceremony in the village church where Thomas had been baptized. Sarah wore a simple white dress and carried wild flowers from Thomas's garden. The guest list included local farmers and villagers alongside CEOs and board members, creating an unlikely community united by their love for the bride and groom. Sarah never fully left her corporate responsibilities, but she restructured her life around what mattered most. She moved to Milbrook, running Sterling Industries remotely and making frequent trips to the city only when necessary. She and Thomas created a foundation focused on environmental conservation, using her resources to protect the kind of wild spaces where they'd first met. And sometimes when young couples walked the marked trails through Thomas's woods, Sarah would tell them the story of Devil's Bog, how it had claimed her boots and nearly her life, but had given her something far more valuable in return. Sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in the most unexpected places, waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to venture off the beaten path. In a world that often measures worth by wealth, the richest rewards come from hearts generous enough to give without counting the cost.